Well, welcome, folks, to this edition of the 700 Club. War drums are sounding in the Middle East. Will there be a war? Is Iran trying to incite America to bring war against them? And was the NSA let go against the cyber attacks coming out of Russia? And were the generals trying to keep it from the president? And was the release of it by the New York Times, was that treason? And you look at the polls, there's some shock value as Bernie is ahead of the president by a substantial margin. Joe Biden is way ahead. Other of the lesser Democrats are ahead in certain polls that are being released. Is this, quote, fake news, or is something real coming? Well, the war threats comes as the U.S. is urging its allies to prepare for action after last week's attack on 2 tankers in the Gulf of Oman. Amber Strong reports on this story.
A spokesperson for the Iranian government says the country will break the uranium stockpile limits set by the Iran nuclear deal in the next 10 days. This as the U.S. drums up support after an attack on 2 Norwegian oil tankers.
It's unmistakable what happened here.
The U.S. says this video from the Pentagon shows Iranians removing an unexploded mine. They also blame Iran for attempting to shoot down a U.S. drone.
The intelligence community has lots of data, lots of evidence. The world will come to see much of it, but the American people should rest assured we have high confidence with respect to who conducted these attacks.
While countries like the U.K. and Saudi Arabia believe the U.S. intelligence, others like Germany and Japan aren't so sure. National Security Advisor Brad Bowman tells CBN News the intel is convincing.
Very few entities would have the capability to pull off attacks like this for ships that are underway, using the means that appear to have been used. And by the way, Iran has said they want to shut down the flow of maritime traffic through the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz, near the area where the attacks took place, is critical to global oil supply. Nearly 20% of all crude oil passes through the narrow passage. GOP leaders say the White House has the right to defend American interest.
Unprovoked attacks on commercial shipping warrant a retaliatory military strike against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Democratic leaders say they too believe Iran is responsible, but say the silence from allies is telling.
What we see is a split of the U.S. from our allies, and we see Russia and China coming together. The maximalist pressure campaign has maximally failed.
They also caution against what looks like a familiar roadmap to war.
What we see out of the White House is something disturbingly reminiscent of the kind of accelerating drumbeat that got us into the war in Iraq.
Now, the administration insists the president does not want war with Iran, but is considering the full range of options. Amber Strong, CBN News, Washington.
Well, once again, folks, I've said before, it's time for Americans to get together. We only have one president. We only have one leader in terms of foreign policy, not 500 members of Congress, but only one president. And so all these people can snip at him, but we've got to recognize we have an existential threat. Now, the thing that I've been concerned about and talking about is the vulnerability of our power grid. You see, these power systems are hooked together across regional and in some cases national lines, and they are very vulnerable to some kind of an attack. I was thinking if we had a nuclear blast, low-level nuclear, it could fry our entire system. If there was a solar flare, it could do the same thing. And you could imagine, just think for a minute, how your life would be if you had no electricity. Think what you would do if you couldn't turn on an air conditioner. Think if you couldn't have a refrigerator. Think if you couldn't have a heating unit, cooling unit, etc. And if the grocery stores couldn't refrigerate their produce and their frozen goods, we would be without the necessary substance. In a matter of a few days, the shutoff of power would be devastating. Now, China and Russia have been hacking into our grid. They have done everything they can to steal the vital records of our Defense Department, of our department stores, of our banks, etc. So I have said, and it makes a lot of sense, the NSA has vastly superior capacity than any other organization in the world to go on a cyber attack. And they have the absolute ability to put in malware or other kinds of false information into the power grid of an opposing nation. And with that grid, they can wreak chaos on these countries. Now, the president is saying the New York Times was guilty of, quote, virtual treason by bringing out a story that indicated we might have that in our mind and be prepared to go with it. John Jessup has more.
That is right, Pat. The president responding to a Times story that the U.S. is taking aggressive action to target Russia's power grid. The paper reported U.S. cyber ops are inserting malicious code in Russia's power grid and other targets, a threat that could cripple their systems if unleashed. It's a sign the U.S. is going on the offensive to counter Russian intrusions in our own systems. However, the president tweeted Sunday the story is not only untrue, but that it's a, quote, virtual act of treason. The Times said security officials did not express concerns about revealing the operation, also reporting that defense officials might not have briefed the president on details, citing concern among Pentagon and intelligence officials that he might put a stop to the program or talk about it with other governments. Administration supporters say the action is long overdue.
The White House have already pushed back against a number of elements of the story. But the bottom line is the president's taking aggressive action against Russia. I wish that would have happened in 2016.
Last summer, President Trump signed a directive giving U.S. Cyber Command more leeway to carry out offensive operations without presidential approval. Well, President Trump said he believes former President Barack Obama knew U.S. intelligence agencies were investigating his 2016 campaign. He spoke about it recently in an exclusive interview with ABC News' George Stephanopoulos.
Clearly believe there was a group of people working against you. Do you think President Obama was behind it?
I would say that he certainly must have known about it because it went very high up in the chain, but you're going to find that out. I'm not going to make that statement quite yet, but I would say that President Obama had to know about it.
Attorney General William Barr is investigating the origins of the probe into suspected connections between the Trump campaign and Russia. Well, just a day before Donald Trump kicks off his 2020 re-election campaign, a Fox News poll shows how voters would vote if the election were held today. In head-to-head matchups, Trump trails every Democrat. Former Vice President Biden leading by 10 points, Bernie Sanders has a 9-point lead, and Elizabeth Warren a narrow 2-point margin. Among Democratic voters, Joe Biden leads the pack for the party's nomination at 32%. Sanders sits at 13%, and it's essentially a three-way tie with Warren at 9% and Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris at 8% each. Meanwhile, the president is cutting ties with some of his pollsters, Pat, after leaked internal numbers showed him trailing Biden.
You know, he had a pollster who had figured out how to work Facebook, and he did so brilliantly, and as a result, without spending a great deal of money, Trump moved ahead dramatically because of the stuff that was put on Facebook and what was called social media. In the old days when I was involved in national politics, the big thing was the candidate needed to stay on message. And I remember when George Bush was running, he began to give interviews. And as he did, his poll numbers went way down, and the number of his opponent, Michael Dukakis, went way up. And finally, they said, you will only speak on what is on the 4x6 cards, and when you go out, everything is on prepared, and you will be on message. And then the message is going to be tax cuts, if the message is going to be prosperity, if the message is going to be whatever, that will be the day's message, and you stay on message. To give an interview to a man who used to be a flack for Clinton was just insane, very frankly. And I mean, it was just insane to give that kind of access hour after hour to Stephanopoulos was, frankly, an act of reckless disregard of the reality of politics. He's got to stay on message, and he doesn't have around him anybody to tell him to stay on message. And so when he gets off on these tangents, he takes away from the essential core of what his message is, and the message is it's the strongest economy on record. It is an incredible economy. It's doing a fabulous job. more people are being employed, businesses are going and so forth. But don't be making wild claims about deals with Mexico. Don't be saying things that will set you off. Don't be criticizing fake news and all the rest of it. Stay on message. That's how you win, John.
Pat, a record number of migrants from Africa are entering the U.S. illegally through the southern border. In just 1 week, the Border Patrol in one sector detained more than 500 migrants from African nations. That's more than were detained along the entire border in 2018. The migrants include Ethiopians, Eritreans, Sudanese, and Congolese who fly across the Atlantic to South America and then trek into the U.S. The African migrants present new challenges for Border Patrol agents who are used to dealing with Spanish-speaking migrants. Well, since October, the Border Patrol has detained nearly 600,000 migrants on the border, more than all of last year. Meanwhile, Congress and the White House are still fighting over funding for a border wall, with the administration facing lawsuits at nearly every turn. Chuck Holton has this report from the southern border.
We're asking for an order blocking the use of these funds that Congress didn't appropriate to build a wall on the border. It's very simple. They didn't get the money for it. They can't build it.
Sierra Club members are dedicated to protecting fragile ecosystems and long-standing communities on the southern border. And obviously building a 1,500-mile contiguous wall is certainly not going to help us in that endeavor.
While these legal and political battles wage on, better barriers are going up, courtesy of the military and the Army Corps of Engineers. One of the stated missions of that agency's 37,000 civilian and military employees is to deliver vital public and military engineering services to strengthen our nation's security. The thousands of illegal crossers entering the United States each day from many different countries are a definite security concern, especially for locals like this El Paso woman.
There is an urgency. Yes, there is. They're coming in now. It was by the hundreds, now it's by the thousands a day. We have to do something. Thousands of people are going to be released into our community, and we don't even know who they are.
The U.S. Border Patrol used existing funding that was authorized under the Obama administration to recently build about 4 miles of this bollard-style fencing. It's 18 feet high, it's got no climb on the top, and it works very effectively against people crossing illegally. But here's the problem. If you only do the fencing 4 miles at a time, what you run into is what we have right here. The fence ends, and now here's Mexico over on this side. So it's not very difficult for people to just walk right around the fence and come into the United States illegally.
We have to do something. I suggest that. I was hoping that they would just bring martial law. They need to bring martial law.
And while arguments continue thousands of miles away in Washington over whether this is a national emergency, border authorities and American citizens struggle with the daily crush of illegal crossers and thousands being released onto city streets. From El Paso, Texas, I'm Chuck Holton for CBN News.
Pat, back to you.
It's astounding to me that there's a debate on this, that there's somehow, you go back in terms of Democrat presidents and also congressmen who all supported the idea that the United States cannot open itself to all the immigrants that want to come to it from all over the world. We can't afford the social services. We can't educate them. We cannot accommodate them in any way. You have to look after your own citizens, and if you don't do it, your country will be destroyed. Now, there may be people who really want to see America destroyed, and it may be that somehow they are so fixated on the idea of not giving Trump a victory in anything that they will oppose any initiative he wants to bring forth. But I know in the last election that Republicans lost big time in the House because the American people at that time were not interested in the border wall. They wanted to know about health care, and they wanted to know about things that dealt with their personal lives. And Trump missed it. The message was the wrong message. But right now, there is an existential threat to the security and the stability of this nation. And somehow or other, Congress has got to act, but they won't do it because of this visceral hatred of the president. A house divided against itself can't stand, is what the Lord said, and it's right. A kingdom divided against itself cannot endure. And if somebody loves America and wants this country to continue as the most powerful force for good in the world, we've got to make sure that we don't bankrupt ourselves by bringing in all these people. You look what's happening in Los Angeles. A once great city is now full of homeless people on the streets. There's disease. There are all kinds of epidemic possibilities. And people are coming in who are sick. And now they're talking about sanctuary cities where anybody that comes in can get sanctuary in a particular city and not be deported. I mean, it's incredible that we think this is a big civil rights issue to look after the people who come from all over the world. We can't do it. It's just an impossibility, and it will destroy our country. I mean, I don't know why. The people ought to be contacting your congressman and say, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a nothing, you've got to stop this invasion in our country. And now when people are coming in, not only from South America, why would somebody from Zaire or Zimbabwe or Sudan want to come to America? I mean, good grief. You think we can take hundreds of millions of people from Africa, hundreds of millions from South America, hundreds of millions from Asia? No way. We can't do it. But we're trying to in the name of, quote, compassion. That isn't compassion. It's stupidity. John?
Pat, a massive blackout left more than 44 million people without electricity across parts of South America, including Argentina, Uruguay, and Paraguay Sunday. Public transportation stopped, shops closed, and people were told to conserve water. The outage in Argentina occurred as voters were heading to the polls for a local election. Initial reports indicate the blackout was caused by a major failure in an electrical grid that serves the countries, but authorities are still unsure what caused the collapse. Well, those large-scale protests in Hong Kong continued this past weekend. Organizers say 2 million people poured into the street Sunday, demanding the resignation of Beijing-backed Administrator Carrie Lam. Lam has already backed away from the extradition bill that started the uproar. It aims to send some Hong Kong residents to China for trial. Critics fear it could be used to crack down on political dissidents. Lam apologized for the bill and has suspended debate, but her opponents, Pat, want the bill killed, and they also want Lam to step down.
You know, Hong Kong is a beautiful place, and it's a place where the Chinese get hard currency. They have what's called the GEMS exchange, which is a very nice exchange for somebody wanting to put an initial company in a public market. Hong Kong had beautiful buildings. They have wonderful infrastructure, and that will all be changed. And it's small wonder those people are rising up in protest. And I think Beijing's getting the message, and we hope so anyhow. We don't want China to gobble up that free enclave that has meant a great deal to the world.